So my name is Andrew Jason Jacono, and this story is called The Carter. If you're listening, whoever or whatever you are, just kill me. Same prayer every morning as he slips into the white suit. Doesn't need her help getting it on anymore, can do it in 2-3 minutes, respirator and all. Only problem today is the new gloves are too tight. Central sent him the wrong size again. But no time to worry. The dead don't wait anymore, and quicker they're off the streets, quicker things will go back to normal. Yeah, fucking right. She used to wake with him, kiss him and say goodbye before he left. But it's been such a long and weary time since he started this job that now she just sleeps through his departure. Still leaves a note on the counter every night for him to read in the morning, though. Today's. Make sure you lock the back door extra good when you get back. Thought I heard someone moaning in the backyard while you were showering last night. Love, L. He squeezes through the front door and checks the carriage of the cart in the driveway, shoos away a sickly-looking raccoon chewing on a piece of flesh from one of yesterday's dumps. His fault for not cleaning, but then again, what would be the point of tidying up if he'd undo his work as soon as he tossed in the first body of the day? He takes the cart's shafts and rolled down the street. He spots 2 bodies as he bears right onto Regis Avenue. A middle-aged man and woman covered in pustules, holding bloated hands. He picks them up, hurls them into the cart, steers out of the way of some brainlessly gallivanting pedestrians who pinch their masked noses in an oddly unified sweep. This the life a man wants, the one he deserves. Yeah, so the story is about a man named Solomon, who's this carter in a city ravaged by this unexplained plague. And basically Carter's job is to wheel around the city with like a literal wooden cart and to haul dead bodies to these places called depots, which are essentially these mass cremation sites. And the narrative kind of tracks a single day in the life of Solomon as he goes around the city, picking up bodies and disposing of them. And on his usual route, he meets a fellow carter who's named Wallace, and who's both like a lot younger than Solomon and a lot more hopeful of his role in kind of helping the city bounce back from the plague. And over the course of a few hours, the characters end up forming this strangely like tender bond in spite of how doomed the world is, and Solomon becomes more hopeful of his situation, whereas Wallace becomes more uncertain of his. I think that's kind of a good summary. Yeah, that is a tough question, but I think well, obviously it's definitely a gradual process, and it can't be forced in any way. So I think the first tip I would give would be to really get to know the characters. For me, that's always the most important thing. Regardless of the story, it's always to know the characters first. So you have to know their histories, their fears, their aspirations, basically everything in their lives and how they're feeling. Know them as well as you would know a good friend, or even as you would know yourself. And then the step after that would be to kind of figure out a few aspects of their character that with the story would be able to be tweaked. So it could be something small. It could be like something as silly as their opinion on what their favorite flavor of ice cream is changes over the course of the story, or it could be something really big, as big as their worldview or their emotional state. So I think no matter what the scale of the change is, it all goes toward bringing the character closer to a new sense of consciousness. And I think the reader will always appreciate when you do that, because they themselves are the ones who are changing, in real life, and they're watching this character go through the same kind of thing. And it's only relatable. It's just something we all go through, and we all want to understand and see reflected in fiction and in narrative more generally. And as far as constructing and writing about those changes, that's the more difficult thing to parse. But I think what you have to do is you have to figure out a way to kind of verbalize internal struggle without clunkily addressing it. Because if you clunkily address it like in some kind of expository, monologue, it's just going to come off as cheap at best and like forced at worst. And I think having the characters act, in visible ways, it could be in dialogue or just in, plot developments. I think that's your stomping ground for change. You have to be willing to wonder how external and internal factors can change the way your character operates, not just in the narrative, but as a human being. Because I think that's really what characters are in the end, is they're fellow human beings, and we have to treat them as such, even if they're fictional. You know. Yeah, I was thinking about this. I think probably the best example, in my opinion, would be The Remains of the Day. It's by Kazuo Ishiguro. He won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. It's about this really dedicated English butler during like the post-World War II period, and he takes his week-long vacation around the English countryside at the request of his boss, because all this butler does is just work. He doesn't take any vacation. He does nothing like that. And the entire book is just him looking back on his career and like trying so hard to justify how working as a butler and being so shamelessly devoted to it completely destroyed him as a human being. And his name is Stevens, and he starts out as this dedicated, like really bright-eyed worker who's like striving to be the best servant to his employer that he can be. And then over time he becomes this progressively like subservient and just broken man with like a stunted emotional life. He like basically ignores his own father's death when it occurs, and cuts out of his life this woman that he doesn't want to admit he loves. And I think maybe the most tragic part of the transformation is that he kind of hints at being able to see that his life could have gone another way easily if he'd taken the action. But he chose to stay faithful to his duty to a fault, and that just ended up destroying him. And I think it's just this really wonderful example of the dangers of bending to expectation at the expense of your own happiness. And in a way, I think in my writings, I tried to emulate this a lot, and I think Solomon in the story that I wrote, The Carter, I think him and Stevens are similar, like in the fact that deep down they want this transformation that can make their lives better, but they just don't have the tools to go about pursuing that transformation. And I think that's a real tragedy, but that's just how it ends up sometimes. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think multidimensional characters are characters that have enough fleshed out emotional features to be convincing as a human, like outside of a narrative context. And their personalities and ways of interacting with the world are like they permeate their thoughts and actions in everything they do. And I think one of my favorite ways to like deepen a character's personality in a pretty subtle way is to assign them gestures, like physical gestures, depending on a situation. I'm a big fan of this. So if they're nervous, for example, you might have them putting their hands in their pockets or biting their nails or tapping their foot on the floor, something to give a tell that shows, their multidimensionality and their emotions, rather than just explaining it away. And you can just avoid writing paragraphs and paragraphs of expository information just by giving them a simple gesture, which I think is really effective. And this doesn't encompass the entirety of a character, obviously, and the entirety of a multidimensional character, but it shows what exposition just can't, or what it just shows what exposition would take to show in a much longer time. And I think, like I said before, multidimensional characters have entire histories that just aren't necessarily mentioned on the page. Like, the more time an author spends giving the character their own personal history, the realer that character is going to feel to the reader. And it's just like studying for like a test. It's like you fill your head with as many facts as possible about this character, so that when the time comes to utilize the knowledge of that character, you'll be completely prepared to just deploy all of that juicy detail. And like, the only way for a character to feel real, for me at least, is to do everything in your power to make them as real and immediate as like your best friend or like your worst enemy. And I think fundamentally it all comes down to knowing what people are like in the real world, and just interacting with people and understanding them, and kind of seeing how they interact with the world around them. Just the National Endowment of the Arts for supporting all kinds of art, supporting poetry and writing and fiction. They're doing some great work out there, and I really support them. Also, the Academy of American Poets. I actually used to work there a few years ago, and I really
I really love what they do, and trying to keep poetry and narrative and verse alive. It's really important to me, and I definitely commend them for all the work they're doing to keep the arts alive.
Yeah, so it's funny. The beginning of the story kind of came out of nowhere. I wrote this at a time when I was sort of freestyling the first few lines of a story and seeing where it went. So the first line was completely out of nowhere. It was just random, and I had no idea where it was going to go from there. And then the events kind of developed naturally after that point. I think the fact that I wrote this during the pandemic, I think it was around June or July of 2020. I think that the plague theme influenced the writing of it. And I just remember at the time feeling really alone and kind of dejected and uncertain about the state of things, and having the characters find a pretty strong connection despite their physical and emotional distances was really comforting. And as for the ending, I mean, I knew that Solomon's journey couldn't end completely happily, with him and Wallace just becoming friends and, dilly-dallying into the sunset. That just wouldn't be realistic to the world and to the story I was trying to tell. So what I wrote about was Solomon coming home to his wife, whose name is Ella, and she's just as jaded and hopeless as Solomon was at the beginning of the story. And I had her tell Solomon that she wouldn't be surprised if in a few days Wallace, who was his new friend, ended up just dying on the job, which is a rather common occurrence. And Solomon goes outside and he starts to cry, and it's kind of revealed that he's been doing that, going outside and crying for who knows how long. And it kind of also turns out that the jaded, sort of hopeless front he puts on is actually a lot more, sad and broken than the reader initially thought. And I think that transformation, from this jaded guy to this really emotionally bereft, carter whose job is to just cart around dead bodies. And I think that's what gives him his humanity in the end. And it's not like he's lost it, but it's been stifled by circumstances that are pretty much completely out of his control.